Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's wonderful to see all of you and to be here together. My name is Cecilie Kern. I'm the Vice Chair of the NGO Committee on Migration and a member of the NGO Committee to Stop Trafficking in Persons. And on behalf of both committees, I would like to welcome you to our event in commemoration of the World Day Against Child Labor, Improving Outcomes for Migrant Children at the Risk of Trafficking. And this event is also taking place during the International Year for the Elimination of Child Labor, which aims to address the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic and accelerate progress towards the goal set in SDG 8.7 to end all forms of child labor by 2025. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. We're hoping that this will be an interactive conversation, so we encourage you to submit any questions and comments in the chat box. We will have an opportunity for questions throughout the event. This Zoom session has been selected as a meeting rather than a webinar, which allows us to all see each other. You can choose to view today's event in speaker view rather than gallery view if you wish, which allows you to see the active speaker rather than all of the attendees. And this option can be selected in the top right-hand corner of your screen. Please keep your microphone muted so that we can hear our speakers clearly. And finally, this session is being recorded for future viewing. And with that out of the way, we have a wonderful group of expert speakers who will share their insights and experiences at the intersection of migration, trafficking, and child labor. So without further ado, I will give the floor to our moderator, Leif Coorlim.
Hello, everybody. It's lovely to see you all. I've got your faces here in gallery view, so I'll be watching you guys throughout, making sure everybody's paying attention today. Like Cecilie said, I'm Leif Coorlim. I'm the executive editor of the CNN Freedom Project, which is our network's effort to join the fight against modern-day slavery while amplifying the voices of survivors and those working with them on the ground to secure freedom for all people. I want to start off by thanking Catherine Pratty, Jackie Shapiro, Cecilie Kern, Veronica Brand, and Maria Pia Bologna, and everybody else at the NGO Committee on Migration and the Committee to Stop Trafficking in Persons, for organizing today's discussion. You guys have been, just absolutely wonderful and focused in bringing this panel together. And today, of course, we are focusing on improving outcomes for migrant children at risk of trafficking. I'm going to get to the esteemed panel in just a moment, but first I was asked to just say a few words about why today's discussion is so relevant and important, in light of what's going on in the world. Now, as many of you know, the International Labor Organization released its report on child labor last week, and for the first time in 2 decades, the number of children in child labor actually rose, from 152 million to 160 million children worldwide. Just about half of these children are involved in hazardous work, jobs like mining or farming that would be, difficult for you or me to do. And these aren't like, 15 or 16-year-old strapping young lads. What was really striking to me, was from the report, children between the ages of 5 to 11 account for more than half of the total global figure. Now, at the same time, there are more than 250 million migrants around the world. That's about 3.5% of the world's population. And whether it's because of violence or conflict, droughts, floods, climate change, or they're just simply moving in search of economic opportunities because of a lack thereof in their respective home countries. This is going to be something that's going to affect all of us eventually in one way or another. And, I think we all know, in the past 16 months, the problem has only been exacerbated and accelerated. The pandemic has closed borders and increased barriers for migrants. Less children are going to school now, and according to UNICEF, the number of children living in poverty has increased by 15% to 1.2 billion. So now is really the perfect time for us to be having these conversations. And without further ado, I'm going to stop talking and get to our esteemed panel, each of whom will introduce themselves and share some of the great work they're doing to protect children around the world. So let's begin with Mama Fatima Singhateh with some opening remarks. Mama.
Thank you very much, Leif, for that introduction. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. I'm very pleased to be here with you, and I'm honored to be giving these keynote remarks. My name is Mama Fatima Singhateh, and I'm the UN Special Rapporteur on the sale and sexual exploitation of children. As the UN Special Rapporteur on the sale and sexual exploitation of children, I find the theme for this webinar very close to the issues I've been mandated to address. My mandate requires me to analyze the root causes of sale and sexual exploitation of children, identify new patterns of the phenomena, exchange good practices to combat it, promote measures to prevent it, and make recommendations for the rehabilitation of child victims of sale and sexual exploitation. This is usually done through country visits, thematic studies, advocacy, and communications with governments and companies. Some of the many manifestations of sale and sexual exploitation of children include sale of children for the purposes of forced labor, child marriage, and child trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation. According to the International Organization for Migration, 1 in every 8 migrants worldwide is a child. Children migrate for different reasons, and these include fleeing persecution, humanitarian crisis, poverty, to reunite with family members abroad, or for educational opportunities. Many of these migrant children are vulnerable to transnational organized crimes and exploitation practices, including trafficking in person, sale of children for the purposes of forced labor at all stages of the migration process, especially if they're traveling alone or embarking on an irregular migration. In its worst form, child labor includes domestic servitude and slavery, forced marriage, sexual exploitation, and hazardous work that put children at risk of disease, injury, or death. We also know that the causes of child labor, in addition to migration, include poverty, discrimination, illiteracy, and humanitarian crisis. I recently presented my report to the Human Rights Council on the impact of the coronavirus disease on the different manifestation of sale and sexual exploitation of children. In the report, I highlighted the fact that the unprecedented socioeconomic crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the existing stark inequalities and the vulnerability of the most disadvantaged children, thereby amplifying the risk of exposing them to sale, trafficking, and sexual exploitation globally. I noted that the socioeconomic consequences of the pandemic resulted to an increased rate in poverty, discrimination, and inequality, and that the impact of the pandemic has also disproportionately been hard on millions of people on the move, including forcibly displaced, refugee, and internally displaced girls and boys, among whom unaccompanied and separated children are particularly vulnerable and are exposed to the high risk of being sold or trafficked and becoming victims of forced labor, domestic servitude, forced marriage, sexual abuse, and sexual exploitation. There is therefore an urgent and important need to protect migrant children from conditions that expose them to forced labor, trafficking, and sexual exploitation. We have already heard from Cecilie that 2 years ago, the UN General Assembly, through the resolution, declared 2021 the International Year for the Elimination of Child Labor. And member states committed, and I quote, to take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labor, end modern-day slavery and human trafficking, and secure the prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labor, including recruitment and use of child soldiers. And by 2025, end all forms of child labor. Yet, following the recently released joint UNICEF and ILO report on child labor global estimates 2020, the headline that is currently dominating the media space is the fact that the number of child labor has risen to 160 million worldwide, with millions more at risk due to the impact of COVID-19. Therefore, in commemoration of the World Day Against Child Labor, which was celebrated and is celebrated every June 12 each year, we must reflect on the state of affairs of children all over the world, especially migrant children, and ponder on the solutions to address the problems they face. Addressing these problems for migrant children requires a comprehensive, holistic approach and commitment from all stakeholders, including governments, the civil society, the UN systems, and companies. The UN Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants, in his UN report to the UN General Assembly in 2009, proposed that providing protection to children in the context of migration demands that issues related to irregular migration be considered, since they affect the enjoyments of children's human rights. According to the Special Rapporteur, the criminalization of irregular migration has proved to be the root of ill treatment and other human rights abuses, especially where unaccompanied and undocumented children are concerned in transit and destination countries where irregular migration is punished with imprisonment. The Special Rapporteur further states that the protection of children during migration necessarily implies a gender dimension, since women and girls account for almost 50% of international migrants. That the gender dimension also includes issues relating to trafficking in persons for the purposes of sexual exploitation, forced labor, and other forms of exploitation, as well as other abuses to which the girl child is more vulnerable during migration, such as requests for sexual favors in exchange for protection or for the promise to cross borders. Addressing the issue of the root causes of migration should be a priority. The provision of access to education and employment opportunities by governments and the reduction of the drivers of forced migration requires cooperation and collaboration amongst governments and the international community. Excuse me. There's also the need for governments of countries of origin, transit, and destination to put in place functioning child protection system to reduce the vulnerability of migrant children, because the deficiency in the system pushed children to place their trust in traffickers and perpetrators rather than competent child protection authorities. In terms of labor, governments and other stakeholders must also take into account the demand factors as well as the specific vulnerability of the migrant child, while recognizing that children are rights holders and taking into account their best interests as primary consideration in all migration-related initiatives and actions concerning them at all levels. The formulation of solid national legal frameworks that protect the child and criminalizes child labor would contribute towards preventing this phenomenon, together, of course, with adequate budgetary allocation and well-trained and equipped law enforcement. A system must also be put in place for the identification of victims and referring them to well-equipped and resourced child protection system. The problems migrant children face are transboundary. They therefore require an international, national, and multi-sectoral solution. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mama Fatima, for such a wonderful overview of the problem. Let's go to Mr. De La Mora Salcedo. Fernando, if you could start with your title and then introduce us a little bit about your work, please.
Sure, thanks very much, Leif, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be. Many thanks to the organizers for putting it together. The NGO Committee on Migration has always done great work and been very present over the last few years on this topic, where we've seen quite a bit of movement at the UN. I coordinate economic, social, humanitarian, and human rights matters at the Permanent Mission of Mexico to the UN. And so we're one of many countries working in the multilateral context to begin addressing some of these inherently multidimensional challenges. And I think the Special Rapporteur really summed up very well the fact that this is not solely a matter of transnational organized crime, but goes much, much deeper into questions of governmental capacity, lack of economic opportunity, insufficient advances with regards to empowerment of women and girls. And so at the United Nations, speaking amongst countries, we often come across a confusion that I think would be useful in the context of this webinar to flesh out at the beginning. And it's a confusion between migrant smuggling and human trafficking. Migrant smuggling is, as you know, a crime against the state, and it requires the illicit movement across international borders with an economic exchange. Whereas human trafficking does not require crossing any international borders. And until recently, the UNODC figures showed us that most human trafficking actually took place within borders and has these components of exploitation and coerciveness, and is fundamentally a crime against a person. This is why we have two additional protocols that are separate, one on migrant smuggling and one on human trafficking. Which is not to say that what brings us together here today for this event is not relevant, because indeed there is a relationship between these two types of crimes, and in no place is it more visible than in the case of children who, as the Special Rapporteur said, when unaccompanied, are particularly vulnerable, whether it be to forced labor, which, as was mentioned, this year is the year for the elimination of all forms of child labor, or in the case of sexual exploitation. It's because migration is a multidimensional phenomenon, no government, no country, no matter who it is, can effectively address it on their own. And so I think some of the things that we hope to speak about later on with the other panelists will be the value added of having identified very concrete best practices, namely in the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, in its Objective 10. The entire Global Compact has 10 guiding principles, one of them being that it be child sensitive. When we address children in international law, we have to remember that the most internationally ratified of all of the conventions is the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which provides a very strong reference point for anything having to do with children. And so I think what we've learned is that we do need to strengthen capacities, particularly with regards to identification of victims, because no matter which statistics you look at, more likely than not, these are underreported globally. We also have learned that in addressing human trafficking, we need to take a victim-centered approach, which includes providing assistance, protection, redress to those victims, increasingly including the need for psychosocial support that I would highlight. Also, ending the impunity of the trafficking networks, which requires a lot of financial intelligence sharing across countries as well. Also, it's about discouraging demand. Human trafficking exists because there is a demand. That also can, in some cases, be linked to a lack of economic opportunity. And in the case of the pandemic, it's also linked to the fact that over 180 million children have been left without schooling in the context of the pandemic, which creates spaces that are ripe for human traffickers to exploit. Finally, I would say that hopefully we also get to talk about partnerships. Just as no government can inherently, on their own, address an inherently transnational issue like migration, no government can comprehensively address human trafficking, which is a multidimensional issue, without the partnerships that involve civil society and the private sector. And there's some good examples that I'm confident will come up in the conversation. So thanks very much, Leif, and looking forward to it.
Thank you, Fernando. I'm looking forward to the discussion that lies ahead. Next is Ms. Saskia Blume. Saskia, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you do at UNICEF.
Sure, thank you so much, Leif, and it's an Absolute honor to be here among such amazing panelists, and especially warm welcome to Kwami, who I think is going to talk just after me. I'm really excited to be on a panel with you. So as Leif has said, my name is Saskia Blume. I'm the deputy lead of UNICEF's global migration team, or Children on the Move team. And in a nutshell, what our team does is to look at everything that UNICEF does across caring for children, healthcare, child protection, education, social protection, WASH, to ensure that our own programming, advocacy, and data really reflects upon three facts. First is to ensure that our programming is inclusive, so that migrant children have access to all of these services on an equal footing. Secondly, to minimize protection risk, which we're going to talk about a lot today. One of the key areas we're working on, for example, is child immigration detention, in addition to trafficking, which we'll talk about more today. And then thirdly, to really empower young migrant, to really also tell the positive story about migration, which I think is really important and often gets lost. And of course, we work upstream with government partners, but also none of this work can be done without a really strong NGO and CSO community. And a lot of our partners are on the call, I think, today as well. So thank you for everyone. And this is really a community effort, and only together we can deliver on all of this. I think in the prep, I was asked to maybe briefly mention also some of the work we're doing on trafficking in particular. And again, this is with many partners on the call and beyond. I think Fernando put it quite well in terms of that the root causes of trafficking are interlinked with, they're all interlinked to also cause other child protection risk, right? So when we're looking at child labor, when we're looking at child marriage, when we're looking at the dangerous forms of migration, when we're looking at trafficking, a lot of these root causes for these phenomena are interlinked. And so, just to pick out maybe 4 interventions that we're looking at in particular. One is having strong and really inclusive education and social protection systems. And here, universal child grants are really important, came out really strongly again during the pandemic, and really need to be rolled out much better across the globe. Key entry point, of course, to both prevent and protect children are strong child protection systems. Concretely, this is about training social workers, establishing foster care systems, having child-friendly justice systems, and so forth. Thirdly, maybe to throw in another aspect into this wide discussion that we're having already, is the dangers online. A lot of trafficking now happens online, and online exploitation is definitely an issue that has even come more to the forefront over the last year of the pandemic. So here we're working at a global level, along with many other organizations, with industry leaders and tech companies to make the internet safer, but also in about 30 countries at national level, again with the governments and CSO, the media, and businesses to work on national responses to this phenomena. And lastly, and this is also reflected in GCM that Fernando had referenced, safe options to move, especially looking at family reunification, which is a big one that's also reflected in the GCM. And maybe let me end. So I was asked to maybe say a little bit more about how I came to this. I actually came to headquarters of UNICEF about 5 years ago after having worked in Myanmar with IDP children, with the Rohingya children, also the Kachin children in Myanmar, and having also seen the Andaman boat crisis, the first one, firsthand, and really seeing how children are not only caught up in displacement, but also in the politics and regional policies of migration, right? And so for UNICEF, really what is key to emphasize is that the Convention on the Rights of the Child and all the rights enshrined in the Convention are for all children in a country, not of a country. And this is what, we're working on making a reality, basically. So really looking forward to the discussion today. Thanks, Leif.
Thank you, Saskia. Unfortunately, we are still waiting for our 4th panelist, Kwami. to join us. He's having some connectivity issues, so hopefully he can get that worked out and we can have him join the conversation a little bit later on. So I think I'm just going to jump into my questions that I have for our esteemed panel, and I'm going to start with you, Mrs. Singhateh. In your report on the impact of coronavirus and the sale of and exploitation of children earlier this year, you said, quote, "The pandemic has reinforced the vulnerabilities of those suffering from the consequences of protracted humanitarian crises," end quote. Can you describe how this is manifesting itself, and also what obligations governments have to fulfill their legally binding commitments? Like, for example, those who've signed on to the Convention of the Rights of the Child, which aims to protect and care for child migrants.
Thank you very much, Leif, for that question. Yes, I had also, I think in my keynote address, I mentioned the report I presented to the Human Rights Council. And just as a background, we know that a crisis such as the pandemic is usually accompanied with breakdown in social protection structures, such as, for example, erosion of essential services, inequalities, poverty. And of course, this is made worse by an increased exposure to the most vulnerable. And we know them to be children, and they're exposed to and vulnerable to sale, trafficking, and exploitation. So I had stated in my report that refugees and internally displaced persons affected by armed conflicts, for example, were resorting to negative coping mechanisms, such as child labor, child marriage, transactional sex, excuse me, because many increasingly are going into debt. And because of that, they're struggling to pay for food and they're struggling to pay their rent because of the pandemic. So this is just one of the many ways that the pandemic has reinforced the vulnerability of those suffering from consequences of protracted humanitarian crisis. I also wanted to add that in my report, I highlighted that the COVID pandemic caused a disruption of the services because a lot of attention and resources were diverted to addressing the health and containment measures caused by the pandemic. So much so that some educational skills, empowerment, and intervention programs were paused. For instance, because of the lockdown, children were required to work or to study remotely. This meant that those with no access to remote learning facilities were forced to drop out of school. This, of course, coupled with the effects of poverty, exposed the children to risk of forced marriage, domestic servitude, sexual exploitation, and sometimes even irregular migration. Now to your question on the obligations, the commitments by government, the legal binding commitments and obligations of governments, we know that, well, I believe that commitments of government to international convention is manifested through ratification. So once ratified, governments of state parties under these conventions are under the obligation to protect the rights of those protected or under the convention that they ratify by incorporating the provisions of the convention into their domestic laws. Now, these domestic laws would prohibit and criminalize the offenses such as, for example, child labor or of the trafficking of persons, and punish the perpetrators, as well as provide for the support of victims under the respective laws. I must also add that governments must also put in place policies that provide for strong social protection services that would alleviate poverty and ensure that families are not forced into circumstances that expose children to the exploitation and abuse that they feel. Over to you, Leif.
Thank you. Those were wonderful remarks. My next question is to Mr. De La Mora Salcedo. Fernando, Mexico is caught in the middle of a massive migration pattern. There are literally thousands of people from Central America passing through your country on their way to the United States. Many are escaping poverty or violence, and they're finding themselves in the middle of a politically divided atmosphere once they reach the border. It was a main topic of conversation, obviously, during the Vice President Kamala Harris's visit to your country last week. So I guess my question is, how is Mexico balancing, the pressures that this is creating for your own citizens while protecting the children and their families as they migrate through?
Thanks very much, Leif. And it's a very timely question. Mexico's no stranger to migration. We have historically been a country of origin, transit, and destination. And so we're familiar with these pressures that you speak of. Now, it's true that over the past few years, we've seen an increase in migration flows coming from South and Central America. And while initial responses from the Mexican communities have been positive and supportive, social integration has, of course, turned sensitive and complex. Mexico is committed to supporting migrant children in their efforts to reunite them with their families through the implementation of localization and family reunification programs. This relies very heavily on local communities and leaders that help migrants while they await reunification and integration in Mexican communities. These are the periods at which we find them to be most at risk. For this reason, we do have a regulatory framework, and in particular, our migration law focuses on addressing and preventing any violence that migrants may face, which is in compliance with international law, but also promoting actions aimed at improving the social condition of migrants and their families and eradicating discrimination against them. This includes providing migration authorities with human rights training, but also very importantly, providing them with training to identify victims of human trafficking, which is a necessary step in order to end impunity and achieve justice. Many times this is linked with ensuring access to health services, which in the context of the pandemic has been challenging for everyone, and strengthening violence prevention campaigns, including through dissemination of positive images. And so one of the important things that we've accomplished recently is a reform of the law, which now prohibits the stay of girls, boys, and adolescents in migration detention centers. This is an important step for protecting the human rights of children and adolescents because it is an implementation of a very important joint recommendation made by the Committee on Migrant Workers and Their Families and the Committee on the Rights of Their Child. So it's about prioritizing family unity and leaving detention really as a last resort. We still have a ways to go, but moving forward in non-custodial settings is certainly, I think, a step in the right direction that can prevent abuse and exploitation. This is, of course, consistent with both the Global Compact for Migration and the Global Compact for refugees, because in discussing this multidimensional phenomenon, I think the key thing, apart from having a child-sensitive and victim-centered approach that we need to take into account is, again, the multidimensional nature of it. If you don't have elements of economic empowerment, gender, institutional strengthening, international cooperation, if any one of those is missing, then that's an opportunity lost. And of course, we're working closely with our partners in the United States, in Central American countries, in setting up strengthened international cooperation in this area, which is not an end, but a continual means that needs to identify these tendencies, identify the best practices, and find particular ways in which we can address these phenomena jointly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those are really great points, and kind of provide a perfect segue to my next question for Saskia. Saskia, we all know that migration is incredibly disruptive, not only to a child's development but also to their sense of security, and that's only been heightened by COVID-19. At the same time, the focus on the pandemic globally has meant, less attention is being given to the needs of migrant children. Maybe you could talk us through a little bit about, your take on the long and short-term effects of what this is going to be meaning for these migrant children and what should be urgently addressed.
Yeah, thanks, Leif. Maybe first of all, let me say a few words on the term disruptive and, in regards to child migration, because, and that's, I think, is important to think about this overall question, whether migration has a negative outcome for children and families really depends on the circumstances. So first of all, is migration the only option for a child and a family, or is it, a choice and there's alternatives to migration movement, because that often makes a difference in terms of, using a smuggler or not, how planned is it, how many resources go into preparing a migration movement. And then in countries of transit and destination, how easy is it for a family to access healthcare? How easy is it for children to actually access schooling and pick up the schooling where they left off, to access protection services? So overall, migration can be an empowering experience and can actually lift children and families out of poverty, better access to health and education and so forth. But again, it depends on the circumstances. And you're absolutely right that for too many children and families, this is not the case. And so when we start, for example, with the dangers on the route, in 2017, we worked together with IOM on a study that looked at the Central and Eastern Mediterranean route into Europe. And 80% of young people that were interviewed said faced exploitation, including sexual exploitation on the way. And this is twice the risk faced by adults. So the dangers for children is very much real, and it's much more pronounced than for adults. In destination countries, as you were saying, for sure, COVID has exacerbated some of the previous patterns of exclusion that we've already been seeing. Even though it's also at the same time been an incredible year to show how important actually migrants are to keep our economies alive, and how many migrants were actually involved in, frontline jobs and keeping essential industries going. But despite this, the world has increasingly looked inwards, and we've done all a little bit of a, navel gazing, I would say, while the needs, of course, have increased. You referred earlier to the numbers of children in poverty. So, right now, an estimated 142 million more children are living in poverty than previous to the pandemic. And this, again, we all know the ripple effects of poverty. This will lead to more migration out of desperation with all the risks that come with that. Secondly, we're looking at, in particular, more migrant children missing out on education, because a lot of the switching to remote and online learning options, those that are least likely to have access to internet and all the facilities that you need to switch to remote education, are those actually that are, with migrant background, refugees, and other displaced. And now also, as we're in this current phase of the pandemic, we see that pattern of exclusion continue. One of the most important interventions that also Mama Fatima had mentioned is social protection. And here we surveyed our own country offices to see how many countries have actually explicitly included, in this case we asked about refugees and asylum seekers in COVID-related socioeconomic response measures, and only 50% have of those that are hosting refugees and asylum seekers. So we see patterns of exclusion continuing that will only make the divide bigger. And all of this result in migrant children being further left behind. And so maybe let me just quickly name 4 urgent interventions. One is that no child and family should be excluded from education, healthcare, and all the socioeconomic recovery options that we have embarked on because of their migration status. Second, the importance of strong child and social protection systems that, I think all of us in the panel have repeatedly emphasized, but it's we cannot emphasize enough how important that is. And this is across countries of origin, transit, and destination. We need to move with the populations. And then thirdly, looking also in the long run at more, what are the training and skills schemes for youth, especially, to really make, jobs future-proof and also facilitate safe mobility of young people. And lastly, I think what I had emphasized at the beginning, the importance of having more safe and legal pathways in line with the GCM that need to be put in place. So thanks, Leif. I leave it here.
Thank you, Saskia. So I think I'm going to take a little break now and open this up for some audience questions. I see we have over 80 participants on the call today, and we really want this to be a interactive discussion for anybody. So those who are watching and listening, there's a little chat function that Zoom has where you can type in some questions, and myself and the organizers of the committee are going to be monitoring that. And I can, as moderator, ask those questions and pass them along. So Jackie, I know you had a question if you'd like to start us off.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for your very insightful presentations. I had a question which perhaps Saskia has covered in some ways, but perhaps there is an elaboration to it. The ILO, UNICEF report on child labor that was just released made one of its recommendations to adopt universal child benefits. And I wanted to know exactly what that would look like for children on the move and how it would eliminate their risk of being trafficked.
Would any of our experts like to jump in?
I can surely kick us off, and then maybe others want to come in as it's related to the UNICEF ILO report. I mean, universal child benefits is really a measure to drastically decrease poverty on a large scale, childhood poverty in particular. I mean, we've also seen this as a COVID response measure introduced in the United States. So this is across high income to low income countries. And I think what we have seen in terms of also the financial benefits of it from a public finance perspective is that as soon as you make grants universal and not selective anymore, you can save a lot of money by taking off the selective element and all the administration that goes around it. And when we're looking particular at including people that have different migration statuses, whether we talk about undocumented migrants or whether we also talk about children left behind that are dependent on remittances, which we have seen, do a real, up and down over the course of last year. It's important that children are protected from these shocks and that they're not dependent on a particular migration status to have access to a baseline of child benefits, because a baseline of child benefits will, make a drastic impact on accessing education and healthcare and other elements of inclusion. This is the short answer. I also want to give other panelists to come in if they want to complement.
We always appreciate the short answers, especially being a TV news producer. Anybody else want to join in? Okay. Well, it's my understanding that we actually have Kwami Adoboe-Herrera joining us. Some of the connectivity issues have been worked out, and I think he's on the phone. Kwame, I read a little bit about your background ahead of today's meeting. Maybe you could share your story and perspectives with the audience. Maybe
Hello,
we
can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hello? So much sorry for all the technology confusions. I am very, very sorry. And I'm glad to be here with you guys right now. So thank you very much for all the participants and all the attendings. And yeah, thank you. Leif, what was your question again? Sorry, just flustered right now.
No worries, my friend. No, I was just asking if you could share a little bit about your, absolutely exceptional story. Just a little bit about your past, and I think you have a lot to add to this discussion in terms of what child labor actually looks like.
Absolutely, yes. So as you mentioned earlier, yes, my name is Kwami Adoboe-Herrera. I was born in Togo, Africa. That's a small country next to Ghana and Benin. We're all neighbors. We're on the west coast of Africa. So just some of you who are wondering where that located, it's a small country. It's not well known, but it's very popular. Very well. It's okay. It's a developing country, so we're not known that well. So yeah, I was brought to this country back in 2006 by a wonderful friend, a family member from back in Togo. He was a really good friend. He was a really good man. From what I understand, I have never met him before, but from my family, from all the people that I grew up with, my dad, my mom, we all loved him. He was a great man. So he basically, offered, be talking about, poverty, we're talking about education. So, he's here in the U.S. and he offered that opportunity for my family to bring me here into the U.S. so I can have a good life and continue with my education, because my parents did not have that education growing up. So that's a challenge that they have faced in the past, and they don't want me to have that. So they are willing to do whatever it takes to allow me to continue their legacy and finish school and be a great man, be somebody that they wish for me to be. So my parents allowed me to come here. So I came here in 2006 with, once I came here, things turned to, south. My family friend that brought me here basically has a different idea and mindset. So he basically using me as his personal slave. I work for him day in, day out. The good thing about it, he knows the system very well. He used the system to his best, to the best. So he was able to put me into school, and three other child that came with. So there were four of us living in one house. So all four of us were able to attend school, to make sure that the government doesn't get on his case. So he put into school. So but behind that, after school, we work day in, day out. I mean, I work from the moment I wake up, like 5 in the morning, until I go to school, and I come back, continue to work, and I had to study. So things were different. Things were very rough for nearly 6 years. I've been doing labor, working for him, for his friends. I've never seen him these monies. My life for 6 years was just tormented. I mean, I was in constant stress. I was depressed. I mean, I was a child. I mean, I didn't know what was going on. I just thought this was normal. I mean, for all I know, is I didn't know this was trafficking. I didn't know this was slavery. I just think this was normal. I did this for him for 6 years until things started to get I started to get more knowledge of schooling. People say school, knowledge is power. School, we need to go to school. If it wasn't for the fact that he put us into school, or put me into school, I wouldn't have that ability to understand what was happening. So because of the fact that he was able to enroll me into school, in turn, I was able to learn about what is happening, why what kind of lifestyle is this I'm living in this house beside my friend. My friends didn't have this kind of lifestyle at home. They were being treated, they have a friend, they have, play sports. I did not have any of these things. My life was basically running for me. Somebody had my life in his hand. He actually did. He has my life in his hand, where everything I do is by the minute, So eventually I started to, dig in more into when I'm at school, my free time, my recess. I'll go to the library, start to read books, do some researches, and then that's when I start to find out that what's happening to me is not normal. This is labor trafficking. This is slavery. This is beyond my understanding. I need to get help. So I'm here today because of that, and I'm able to find that help as quick as I can. It was not an easy process, but overall, I was able to find a better place. I'm in a better place right now than I was 6 years ago. So I'm just excited to be here with you guys to share this wonderful story. As we continue with the conversation, I was able to elaborate more on how those painful 6 years of my life has been. Also, after that 6 year, how things have continued to be difficult for me, and also where I'm right now. So thank you for that question, and I can't wait to continue with our discussion.
Well, of course, like any good journalist, I'm going to ask a follow-up question of you, Kwami.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you could just talk to us a little bit about how you did get help. Who was there to help you? Obviously, so often in these conversations with regards to modern day slavery and forced labor, you hear stories about it happening in your own backyard, or, it's in the house next door. And, quite literally for the people in the United States, this was in our own neighborhood, and it was going on right under our noses. What eventually led you to get help? Like, how did you do that? And, what prevents so many other people from doing so, in your opinion?
Oh, yes. You have to understand that as someone who was migrating into this country, someone who has limited English, I grew up speaking French and Ewe. That's my culture. That's my country. That's what we grew up speaking. So I basically have no English background. So I know of nothing. I mean, to this day, I'm continuing to learn. This English is not easy to learn, so I'm continuing to learn as I go. So to begin with, that I have the barrier to begin with to communicate with somebody about what's happening at the home. And two, I was brainwashed by my trafficker by telling me that the government is my enemy. Okay, that's two. And three, I have no family. If I run away, I have no family to go to. I have nobody to help me. That's three. So as you can see, it just continues going, the cycle of, can I leave? I could leave, but I don't have the support. I have nobody to trust. So as you can see, that is the most difficult thing for someone who is from a different country to have to go through. I could have run away many years ago, but I couldn't. I don't have the source. I don't have roots. I don't know who to trust. I don't have the knowledge of the government, the system. I don't have the knowledge of education. I don't have any of these things to back me up, to help me. And so I continue to live with him, to live with my perpetrator, my trafficker, because he's all I have when I was in this country for that 6 years. He was basically my father, all I need to know. He has control over my life. So I couldn't leave. But due to the fact that I was able to trust and have faith that I will someday find a way to get out of this place, there were times in my life that I want to take my own life. I was just fed up with the beating, the torture, the starvation. I was just fed up. There were times that I wanted to take my own life, but there was just this voice in my head keep telling me, please don't do it. Don't do it. There's a light in the tunnel. There's a light at the end of that tunnel. You're gonna be saved. There's help coming. So I keep on listening to that tiny voice in my head. Every time I try to, I just, it was not an easy decision for me to take my own life, but some things always telling me not to do it, and I'm glad I never did. I never act on that self act of taking my own life. So it was one day I was at school and my teacher reached out to me. I was in 6th grade. I was in middle school. For those of you who are in the U.S., I was in 6th grade, middle school, and my one of the teachers reached out to me and said, "Why do you always come to school with a hoodie on, no matter what time it is, what day it is, no matter what, if it's hot or cold? why do you always wear hoodie? And I broke down into tears. And that's when I revealed to him all the wound on my body, all the physical, all the bruise that I have endured, all the pains I have endured on my, that you can see physical on my body. I mean, the mental, let's put that aside for a second. Just the physical self, she couldn't bear that idea of looking at my skin. And she started to reach out to people around her, friends, anybody that she can get her hand on, anything, anyone she can call. She started to call, to make phone calls, to do whatever she can, research she can, to get involved. As soon as she saw the pains, the beating, the scars on my body, and that's when she said, this is enough. I'm gonna get you help, okay? And so the problem with someone like me who want to escape or kill them is that there's the barrier, there's the fear of a government, there's the fear that your traffickers instill in your life by saying the government is your enemy. So it just keep on going on. It's just continuous cycle that is of fear that somewhere is instilled in your life, that so you can leave, because they need you to make their money. They need you for their business. They need you for their cycle of violence that of making money. And as we all know, I mean, human trafficking is what? The second enterprise business in the whole world. I mean, they make more money than drug trafficking. So, it just continued to elevate from that point on, for that 6 years, things just, from the moment I came to the U.S. until I was rescued, things just escalated, it's constant working, no sleep. It just, to the point my body just started to give up on me. As a child, I was just a child. It's rough. It was a difficult 6 years of my life. And I'm just excited to be here, to find to start getting better life now.
Yeah, absolutely. Kwami, thank you so much for sharing your story, and we're just so grateful that the teacher saw something and stood up and took action, and that you're here to join us today on this call. It's such a harrowing story. And at the Freedom Project, I've been running the Freedom Project for the last 10 years, and we've told more than 1,000 stories that are unfortunately very similar to the story you shared. For my kind of next round of questions, I wanted to draw on some of those experiences with regards to the questions I'm asking the panel. And I'm going to start with you, Mama Fatima. Like I mentioned, we've literally told hundreds of stories specifically on the issue of child labor and forced labor around the world. And, there seems to be a prescriptive pattern where, whenever we confront government officials about the issue, they just, kind of chalk it up to being a problem of poverty. Is that a good enough answer in your opinion? And is that the same answer that you get behind closed doors when you're having conversations with these government leaders?
Thank you, Leif, for that question. Maybe what I should first say is that we know that the causes of child labor goes beyond poverty. I had mentioned in my keynote remarks earlier on that migration, discrimination, illiteracy, humanitarian crises are also causes of child labor. And but I would also add that adequate social protection in my country is a reason why these problems persist, because I believe that the solution to address this problem requires a holistic approach. I've already stated that before, and it involves all stakeholders in addition to governments. I will also say this: I believe that all those governments and state parties who ratify the ILO, for example, the ILO Convention on the Minimum Age and the worst forms of child labor, have shown the political will to addressing the problem. I think the issue now is whether this political will be sustained long enough to result to the formulation of domestic laws that prohibit and punish child labor, and especially in its worst forms, and provide sufficient resources for the effective implementation of the laws and provision of alternatives for families who are forced by the circumstances they find themselves in, that even forced children to the worst forms of child labor. So I'm going to stop here for that, Leif. But also for the record that usually with my work, my communications with governments are confidential until they are not. So I cannot give you specific examples and my specific conversations with government and state parties. But what I will say is it's a more generic response to the question you asked. I hope that answers your question, Leif.
It does, and very well understood. And I appreciate the brevity because we're running a little bit over on the schedule I have here. So, thank you on all accounts. My next question is for Fernando. This is something I'm very personally interested in. We did a investigation several years ago looking at commercial exploitation in Mexico, specifically in Tlaxcala State. And there was a little village in Tlaxcala called Tenancingo, which is kind of notorious for being a pipeline for forced prostitution around the world. The U.S. State Department at one point called it the epicenter for human trafficking into the United States. So my question would be, what is Mexico doing to address these kind of pockets of human trafficking where exploiters have been historically able to operate with impunity?
Thanks very much, Leif, and also really thanks for the work that you do with the Freedom Project, in large part because the way to find these solutions is by making the problems visible. And as you mentioned, many times these things happen in your own backyard. So Mexico's been engaged in the fight against human trafficking, obviously ratifying the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, as well as the protocol. But we've also taken very significant steps to strengthen our own national legal framework, which includes the Federal Penal Code, enabling authorities to actually investigate and sanction offenses relating to trafficking in persons. This has happened at the federal level and is increasingly starting to happen at the state level, where we've seen similar reforms in state penal codes on trafficking in persons. So if you look, for example, at 2020, you'll see a lower number of cases than 2019, but higher sentences on average, and sentences that are sticking. So the road towards ending impunity is, the numbers would suggest is moving in the right direction. We've also published a general law for the prevention and eradication of trafficking in persons. This provides protection and assistance to victims and survivors of the crimes and is seen more as a harmonization of the general law, with 15 Mexican state legislatures having ratified it. Needless to say, the case of Tenancingo and Tlaxcala that you mentioned is a good example of where so many of these multidimensional factors intersect. At its core, this is about lack of empowerment and gender differences. This is about power differentiations, differentiation between men and women, and deeply seated social norms, coupled with a lack of economic opportunity, perhaps insufficient education, certainly a presence of corruption. And fighting corruption is the Mexican government's #1 priority at the moment. I'm confident that as we move towards the battle in rooting out corruption, we will also see important progress against human trafficking and in favor of the victims. And so we have, of course, with the United States, just announced some important joint efforts to combat smuggling and trafficking. This includes now a task force that is going to develop a methodology that seeks to share information and intelligence between the authorities of the two governments. And this is going to allow us to disrupt many of those networks, not all of which, I should add, are international in scope, but can mix with a situation that begins as migrant smuggling can become a situation of exploitation and abuse, not because the traffickers are the smugglers themselves, but because areas where government is not strong, where the state is not present, create situations that are ripe for transnational organized crime to take hold. So the Mexican government is working very closely at creating the economic opportunities through programs like Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro or Sembrando Vida, so that migration is a choice rather than a necessity. Because once you're in that situation of vulnerability, the opportunities to become even further victimized or vulnerable can become increasingly complex to address.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Fernando, for your openness in having this dialogue and, pushing forward on, protecting these survivors of trafficking. Saskia, over to you. I think you mentioned earlier that you'd done some work in Myanmar and, with the Rohingya refugees. It was exactly 2 years ago today that I was in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, home of the world's largest refugee camp, telling these stories of, Rohingya who'd been trafficked out of the camps and were being put onto, pirate fishing ships, ghost ships. But, obviously the world has changed a lot in those 2 years. As the world begins to get vaccinated, I've obviously been very worried about, the people that I met, the Rohingyas living in such crowded quarters. What are some of the challenges you expect that we'll be facing? Do you think that this is going to change migration patterns at all? Do you see there being new hotspots or migration routes emerging, or do you expect it to kind of resume back to the way it had been?
Yeah, thanks, Leif. I think, first of all, I just want to say thank you again to Kwami for joining us and sharing your story, Kwami, and the bravery you've been showing. I mean, it's really for all of us to learn from your lived experience. So thanks I'm very glad, you were able to join after all. I think you're probably the most important panelist here, most important speaker here. So thank you very much for joining. So I think maybe let me give two sides to this answer. The first is, vaccine access has been highly unequal, as we all know, between countries and within countries. I think it's easy to forget, for someone, like me who lives in New York City, where you can now get vaccinated in any subway station. You can literally get vaccinated on your commute, or you can walk into any pharmacy, and it is an extremely privileged position. Only 1% of the overall vaccine supply has gone to low-income countries so far, 1%. So of course this will have an impact on migration patterns, and I'll come back to that, because it's not only highly unequal between countries, but also within countries. We look together with IOM and UNHCR on, inclusion in vaccine plans, but also monitoring the actual implementation. And here 39% include refugees, and then it goes down to 28% for documented migrants and only 16% for undocumented migrants. So it's inclusion, it's inequality between countries and within countries. And even when migrants and refugees are included, there are a lot of practical barriers. Of course, the lack of supply first and foremost, but also firewalls. And I think this came up earlier between health and immigration authorities. If people are scared to go to health authorities, to go to vaccination sites because they're scared of getting detected and deported, this is a major barrier. ID requirements, lack of mobile strategies to reach hard to reach areas and hard to reach populations and so forth. And let me be clear, this is not about prioritizing migrants. It is about, and we're all in line with the same recommendations, it's about public health considerations first. If you decide to vaccinate a certain part of your population, for example, those working in public health or a certain age group, then it should not matter what your migration status is. It just from a pure public health perspective, that's that's how it would be. So if we don't get there, if this patterns of exclusion between countries and within countries continue, definitely I fear that we see continued travel restrictions. Also will impact on accessing education, on training programs, and it will also perpetuate what we're already seeing, having seen emerge over the past year, which is increased level of xenophobia and discrimination. You can only imagine if there are pockets of populations that are not vaccinated and the general population is, how that will spiral further discrimination and xenophobia in countries. And secondly, you're talking about, how have routes changed? I think, we've seen a lot of restrictions go up over the past year. And, at the same time, people that seek protection, those reasons haven't gone away. They still need to seek protection. And on the other hand, this kind of migration out of desperation and not out of choice, how Fernando has phrased it, will also increase because we see all the root causes, go up over the past year. So what does that mean? I think for many, migration will become more dangerous, while at the same time, more people may see the need to migrate. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But if people have only smugglers as their only option to reach a planned destination, there's a power imbalance where it is likely that it will end up in trafficking rather than just a transport from A to B. So these dangers are things that we need to navigate in the coming future.
Great. Thank you so much, Saskia. So we have about 14 minutes left, and I just wanted to ask you all a final question and just kind of do it roundtable style. Let's talk a little bit about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically Goal 8.7, which is the one that aims to end modern slavery and human trafficking, and end child labor in all its forms. Can each of you give me a quick progress report, how we're doing in terms of reaching this goal by 2030, at this current moment that we're in? What are some of the biggest hurdles we're facing? And most importantly, what are some causes or signs that we have for hope? Mama Fatima, can we start with you?
Thank you, Leif. I think this would just be a summary of everything that we have been discussing today. The figures are not good. We've seen the report, the ILO joint UNICEF and ILO report. The figures are not good. And we do know that it will be a struggle to actually meet our deadline, especially with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. But I am very optimistic. I feel that what we're doing is quite impactful, I believe. And we need to continue sensitization. We need to continue raising awareness and advocating for the support of government, advocating that government be provided with support, not only technical support, but financial support to address these problems. I also would like to emphasize the role of community-based NGOs and organizations. I also feel that the provision of support for them in the work that they do, the very important work they do on the ground, is also key to meeting this deadline. Whether we're going to drastically eliminate the whole problem with child labor, the worst form of child labor, I don't know, but I know that it will be seriously reduced if the war continues as it is. So that's all I'm going to say. I'm leaving it on a very high and optimistic note. I know it's possible. I know that if we work together, and I have also emphasized the fact that we need to work together, collaboration and cooperation amongst all stakeholders, government, international organizations, community-based NGOs, everybody has a role to play in addressing this problem. If I may, I also want to raise an issue. A question was raised in the chat box about the role of migrant children and victims of child labor. I feel the law requires them to, the law protects their rights to be heard. And I feel they have to be consulted, especially in view of Kwami's testimony. We know that we need to continue raising awareness so that they know that they have access to some form of complaint mechanism or procedure where they can actually complain about a problem they have or a difficulty that they experience. I also know that when it comes to policies and decision making, we need to consult them, we need to seek their views, we need to seek their opinions, especially on matters that affect their lives and their situation. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, and thank you for working in an extra question from the audience. Fernando, over to you.
Thanks very much, Leif. And I mean, I have to start by echoing everything just mentioned by Madam Special Rapporteur. But you mentioned, the SDGs, and you mentioned 8.7. I think that's where we're starting to get it wrong. The SDGs is fundamentally different from the Millennium Development Goals in that it is now a global, universal, indivisible agenda. We have less than 10 years to implement it, and it's not looking hopeful. In looking at this particular topic that we're discussing today, I think you can't look only at 8.7 without also looking at 10.7, which is safe, orderly, regular migration, but also 16.2, eradicating all forms of violence against children. And one of the pieces of resistance that we see throughout the world is a resistance to see children primarily as rights holders, rather than anything else, not objects, not people that will have rights once they turn 18, but as rights holders. And so we would seem to be falling behind in partnerships, particularly when it comes to financing and capacity building, something which has been, of course, severely affected by the pandemic, with many hard-fought sustainable development gains now falling back, and all trying to find the right formula for a sustainable socioeconomic recovery. And so I would tell you that I share the optimism in that the 2030 Agenda, the Global Compact, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, Alliance 8.7, the Pathfinders to end violence against children, these are frameworks that exist. These are frameworks that work, that need to be strengthened. And so what they do is the 2030 Agenda and these other documents provide us with the roadmap that we need to follow. There's no need anymore to try to rediscover the silver bullet that's going to help us accomplish these things, but rather let's focus on finding the partnerships that allow us to get accelerated actions and then get to 2030 in a much better place than we are right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Very well said. Kwami, do you have hope, for the future in terms of ending modern-day slavery and forced labor, or do you expect things to kind of remain the same in the next decade or so?
I have a hope. Like I have hope to when I was saved, and there's always hope. We just have to work together, just like everybody just been saying. We need to work together. It's not a one-person fight; it's everybody's fight. Trafficking, slavery it's not just one country problem. It's a global issue. As of right now, as being a part of the United States Advisory Council, our action is to continue to advise the agencies that work for the president to help them to overcome some of their trainees. Our goal is to make sure that to help them, to advise, to review some of the laws they have in place already, because we need to make a change to how we are looking at victims, how we are identifying them, how we are treating them, what kind of resources they need to once they have been saved and once they have been find that freedom to be themselves again. What can we do for them? How can we protect them? How can we give them the resources they need to become a member of society again? Because you have to understand, as a victim, everything has been stripped away from us. speaking of my own experience here, everything has been stripped away from me. I didn't have anything to begin once I was saved. I was put into, juvenile delinquency home, and that's not what I need to be. I want to be, so it's just so much we need to do, and continue to talk about this, being able to elaborate and bring awareness to a situation is going to make a difference. We are making a difference right now. All of us on this call, we are listening and we are taking a note, and we're going to take it back to all our organization or back to our community so we can make a difference. Look at our rules, our binders, our whatever we have already. We're going to look at those and adjust that to protecting the life, the human dignity of each person, because that's what it's all about. It's the human person. We need to make it to respect that. And so I have a hope that each one of us on this call today will continue to make that talk go out there to bring awareness to the community, to our government employees, or to our community, wherever we are going to be going to after we are done here, because we need to continue this talk. The talk doesn't end here. After this call, that's when we need to put a rock in. So I have hope that we will make a difference. Like Leif, you've been doing a great job with your freedom, with the Freedom Project, bringing awareness, and you have told us that you have over 200 lives you have been saved already. I mean, that's great. That's things that these are, people don't see it, but it is happening. Your work is making a difference. We are making a difference. We are on this call right now. We are making a huge difference. So I have hope that we will continue to improve, and by in the next decade there will be significant change. And so I have hope, and we will make a difference. Again, we will continue to fight and bring those numbers down. So yes, thank you for that question.
Thank you, my friend, and very well said. Saskia, hurdles and signs of hope.
Yes, thanks. And as we're nearing the final few minutes, maybe just one quick point, which is maybe also on a hopeful note. Up to 2016, we were on a downward trend, right, in regards to reaching the targets in 8.7. And so we know what to do. Of course, we need to accelerate those trends, but we had seen a downward trend before. So how do we get back on track? And here again, we, together with ILO, we did the simulation of how COVID will impact on child labor. And the numbers between, maybe there will be 9 million additional children at risk of being pushed into child labor because of COVID, or 46 million. So there's a huge difference. And what was the key, factor that how we calculated this? It's social protection coverage. So if there's one takeaway, it's how important last year has shown social protection coverage is for children to prevent child labor, but to prevent also all the other aspects that are covered under 8.7 and beyond. There's lots of other aspects, which I think we all alluded to over the course of the last hour and a half together. So I keep it at that as one of the key messages. And thank you, Leif, and over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody. We're just about to time here. I want to make sure that we stay to time, so I'll just keep my closing remarks very short. It's really just such an honor to be able to host this panel of experts, Mrs. Singhateh, Ms. Blume, Mr. Adoboe-Herrera, and Mr. De La Mora Salcedo. Thank you, just for lending your time and talents to such an important cause. I think as we kind of navigate our way back to this post-pandemic world, it's important to remember the millions of people who've had it much worse than us, and to continue to look for ways, whether it's through our work or our charity or, our consumer choices, to support and protect the most vulnerable among us. So if anybody would like to follow up with questions or has a story idea for me, I'm always on the lookout for those. I can be reached at leif.coorlim@warnermedia.com. And I'd just like to say thank you again to our panelists and to our audience members, everybody who joined us. I hope you all have a wonderful week ahead. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Leif, for so expertly guiding our conversation. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks everyone for participating. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you all.